Well, here we go with the annual budget speech. This is my 22nd year. This is by far the biggest and most significant budget. Yesterday morning started off badly. On my bike on the way to Parliament, I hit a pothole the size could have taken a donkey. And I thought, well, I hope they're going to sort that out this year. Then all the bandwidth disappeared at lunchtime completely, as all the press got on the blower. And last night we were in thunderstorms all the way home. So it's been a long trip to get here this time round. And I thought it was going to be all about the problems in Europe and the Greeks and the 1.3 trillion euro, 1.3 billion euro equals 1.3 trillion rand that they're going to borrow. If we were to rewrite the Bible today, we would say, blessed are the Greeks, for they will borrow the earth. Doesn't matter. Apparently, Angela Merkel's favorite song at the moment is Absorber the Greek. Anyway, what's it all about? Well, let's start off with some basic economics. Bring in Thabo Mbeki, the end of his administration in May 2009. JZ comes in and very fortunately makes a wise decision to bring in Pravin Gordhan. And I think that that was something that saved us. Growth rates came back, and by 2010, Pravin Gordhan was in a position to say, hold on, this thing might fix itself. By 2011, it was looking pretty good. But the problem this year is that growth rates have slowed. And that has an enormous impact on the whole story. Because we've had the global credit crunch in red, we've had the recovery. So then Pravin Gordhan a year ago from now said growth rates would be at 3.2%. He was undercalled for the first quarter of last year, but then it disappeared. And by medium-term budget framework speech in October last year, they had to revise it down to 3. And the question is, how low can it go? Where is it going to go from now? We're at below 2. Well, Jill Marcus 3 weeks ago in the last Reserve Bank address said 2.8. The IMF, they say 2.5. And Pravin says, well, split the difference, 2.7 for this year. But growing to 4.2 by 2014. And he bases his figures running forward from there. Now, if one looks at budget deficits a year ago from now, there are Gordhan's figures. He had to revise them down slightly in October, only by 13 billion or so, and that was because of decreased VAT collections as growth rates slowed. What we see now is that there's no real change in game plan. On budgeted deficits, what we are looking at is that the final deficits have been sorted out for 2011, and for 2012, we're looking at a 4.6% of GDP deficit, and that will continue for another year before dropping off to 3.9. And the mythical 3% of GDP at 3.1% won't happen until 2015. And what we're hoping is that that will keep the international rating agencies off South Africa's back. Why are growth rates so critically important? Because if the growth rate slows, then tax receipts slow, then deficits go up, then you get a downgrade, and that causes interest rate increases, and that's the one thing that South Africa cannot afford to have today. An interest rate increase would smash the consumer to leg, and we would be completely finished. It is absolutely critical that Marcus must be left alone at 9% prime overdraft rate, hopefully better, because of the increase in fuel prices, electricity prices, and everything else, the consumer just can't afford it. Our debt to GDP ratios, well, if we go Greek, 166%. Japan is even worse. South Africa is still at below 40%. And that is not so much that we're not borrowing today, but that we didn't borrow in the good times under Trevor Manuel and Mbeki. So we're looking pretty good on that front. The shortfalls in tax identified in October 2011 were only 13 billion rands, and that was on the VAT front only. They said everything else was going to be all right. It was quite a surprise when the final predicted numbers came out yesterday. They looked something like this. Yes, VAT has slowed, 10.2, not 13. Unfortunately, we lost the other 3 on personal tax, coming in a bit under, because of lost job losses, etc. And of course, the housing market is a disaster, so transfer duties down by another $1 billion. But then, surprise, to the rescue comes corporates and STC. Well, if they're going to get those numbers, they're going to have to work like crazy in March, and I'm sure some people are going to get extra second provisional tax requests. Then we smoke too much again, and then there are a couple of other odds and sods, including that carbon tax is starting to perform. Taking the whole budget together, you see that you have the three big taxes. The big issue is we only missed the boat by $4 billion in $742 billion. Personal tax was flat, give or take $3 billion. Corporate tax saved the day, up $11 billion, and VAT was down $10 billion. That's how they balanced the books. The rest of it is really neither here nor there. So then one looks at the tax emphasis, and the problem emerging is that the individual taxpayer is paying too much, 34%. He can't take any more. Meanwhile, starting in the Trevor Manuel era, corporates were doing too well. Lower tax rates to 28%, STC at 10%, lower profits, lower tax bills. So we had to take it out on VAT and individuals tax. And that is what they addressed yesterday. That is the crucial issue. Because if you put together where the increased taxes are coming from next year, it works like this. They're hoping to get an extra $16 billion from corporates in better trading conditions. The loss that they were going to incur on the conversion from STC to dividend tax is not going to happen due to dividend tax implementation. Then you smash them, dividend tax implementation at 15% instead of 10%. They've recovered that loss. I'll look at it more in detail now. Fuel, put up the fuel price, smash the smokers, push up electricity. VAT will have an inflationary increase, and then the individual taxpayer did not get a tax reduction yesterday. Let's call a spade a spade. We are still going to pay 33 billion rand more as individual taxpayers next year. And that's going to be in the form of CGT and some other bits and pieces that we'll look at in a moment. So you have the big three taxes, personal tax and VAT holding it all together, companies on a downward trend, but they're wanting to reverse that trend, and then you see that everything else is more or less insignificant. If one now turns to individual taxpayers, this is the frightening part of South Africa. Of the registered taxpayers, 19% of them don't pay anything because they're below 60,000. Then in the category 60,000 to 120,000, 25% of the taxpayers sit there, but they only pay 4% of the tax. In the category 120,000 to 400,000, we've got 48% of the taxpayers paying 42% of the tax. But then come the wealthy. 9% of the taxpayers, a mere 378,000 people, pay 54% of South Africa's individual tax. That's you and me in this room today, and this is where it's starting to hurt. What we are seeing is through the provisional tax system and accelerating the second provisional tax, they are now collecting 50% of their provisional tax payments by way of the second provisional tax payment. The third has become much smaller than it used to be. And then by adjusting the employees' tax system over the years, it is now really only local interest that is exempt from employees' tax. Everything else is subject to PAYE, so you get it from source, and that reduces the risk of tax structuring. But the problem remains. As we see over the years, the individual's taxes increasing every year and companies declining. They're supposed to be more or less equal, and that is where they went out yesterday to try and get it right. So they start off with the individual taxpayer, and they play the same old game they play every year. So Trevor says he gave back 13, and then Province says 5 in 2010 and 8 in 2011, and a full 9.5 in 2012. So yesterday's headline is 9.5 back to the consumer. But what they're not telling you is that personal taxes will increase by 32 billion rand next year. Because it's not only about the tax table, it's also about how much you're going to tax. So there are our when adjusting the tax tables, they pay the annual gain, increase the bottom bracket, increase the middle order, increase the top bracket, create confusion by increasing rebates. So the old age home doesn't know whether their tax threshold is 63,000, 99,000, or 110,000. You must try explaining that in a presentation in an old age home. It's fantastic fun. So there you have your new tables, and we say, well, what's it going to do? And everybody says that's going to give you 3,000 or 4,000 rand back in your pocket. I don't think so. Because going with this year's new table is from 1st of March, we get the new medical credit system coming in. And so we're saying new table with amendment from last year. So last year they announced and legislated the medical aid credit. And that's 216 proposed in 2011, put up to 230 today. Subsequently, subsequent members were proposed at 144 last year and has gone up to 154 this year. They're also saying additional expenditure will qualify for a rebate if it exceeds 7.5% of taxable income, but you won't get the full 40% relief, you'll only get a maximum of 25%. And the bad news for pensioners is that they are currently exempt from this new system, but they will have to join the system from 2014. So only 2 more years of relief for pensioners. Now watch what it does. Take a person who earns 750,000 today. Take the average wage increase over 4 years, and we find that in 2010 he was earning 595. But his tax comp in 2010 gave him a travel allowance deduction. He's lost that now. And last year he had a medical aid tax-free fringe benefit. That's become a rebate. But then there's another amendment. Group life premiums paid by your employer become fully taxable from the 1st of March. And so do permanent health insurance premiums. Put that all together, and the tax-free portion of his package has increased substantially over 4 years, and so his effective rate of tax, in this example, has gone up from 24% to 29%, and that's why it's hurting. There is no tax reduction in this year. Take it from me, you can quote me on it. The interest exemption has not been increased for this year. That means we'll get a higher pass rate in the board exam next year. But the good thing about it is that this is the last year that we'll have an interest-only exemption. Next year, we're going to a new system, a general savings schemes, which will give a 30,000 rand exemption per annum across the board on all forms of income. We'll have to see what the proposals are as to how it's going to work. You will be allowed 500,000 rands tax-free income in a lifetime from your investments, and then they're going to put in tax-preferred savings schemes by April 2014. Well, we're going to have to see what those are. Wait and see what comes along. But then the big surprise. Every year for the last 10 years, I have used this slide, and it's hardly changed except for reductions in corporate tax rates. Corporates at 28, individuals at 40. Now it all changes. But it's a lethal cocktail, and they're not writing it up properly. And this is the part of the presentation, if you were students, I'd say, wake up, pay attention. Because there are 2 changes. The first one is 1 April, dividend tax takes over from STC. But that was supposed to come in at 10%. Went up to 15% yesterday. So instead of being a 7.2% charge on 100 rands profits, gone up to 9.3, which means that the effective corporate tax rate has gone up to 37.39 on corporate distributed profits compared to 35.2 previously. Notice the arbitrage between that and the individual taxpayer is now 2.5%. That's less than the charges of arbitraging. It's a fantastic difference. But that's not all, because then they go and stuff with it again, because they say, we are now making money from the capital gains tax system 10 years later. And we want to take up the inclusion rates. So we're going to hit at the 50% inclusion rate for companies and take that up to 66.7. And the individual, we're going to take him up to 33.3. People say, so what? Watch the cocktail, how it merges. That takes your effective corporate tax rate on capital gains up to 18.67%. And compared to the individual's 13.33 maximum effective CGT rate. But that's not the end of it, because now with the new definition of dividend coming in, we've got 81.33 of capital reserve to distribute, and the new definition of dividend does not distinguish between capital and revenue reserves. So smash that 81.33 with dividend tax again. And we land up with a 32% effective tax rate on company profits compared to 24% last year. 22% last year. It's up a staggering 10%. You've got to look at the two working together. It's absolutely critical. And then you compare that with the individual who's sitting at 13.33. So you can see individual much better off than company. And they haven't finished yet, because the last one we've got to deal with is that the last one that we have to deal with is that the trusts increased to 66%. Effective CGT rate on a trust, 26.67, okay, compared to 13%. So again, individual king, but not king by as much as in the past. The individual has also had their effective rate increased to, effective annual exemption on CGT increased to 30,000. What does this all mean? The arbitrage between capital and revenue on revenue account is now 5.39% between a company receiving a revenue income and a capital income. Now, last year we made a huge scene about CSARS versus Founders Hill, a big capital and revenue case, multi-million rand expense. And the taxpayer went off to Bloemfontein and came back opgefok met kostes, okay? Taken out by SARS. Would you go and take that capital gain that far? No, not for 5%. That was 32% versus 0. Now we're looking at, you wouldn't even contest it for 5%. So when we see all of these massive tax cases, that's not what tax is about, because the arbitrage is so small. That was one of the objectives that they wanted to achieve when they implemented capital gains tax 10 years ago. Preference shares, I say, are soon to be history. The SGC credit will go by 2017. Many institutions that are basing their preference shares on SGC credit might use it a long time before that. Also, preference shares are great when one has a look at the individual in high time interest. Continuing. Arbitrage of corporate profits versus individual profits, that arbitrage is now only 2.6%, 40% versus 37%. It's not worth it. Arbitrage between corporates and individuals is now 19% on capital income. Do you want to hold your investments in a holding company? I don't think so. Arbitrages on corporates versus retirement funds is now a staggering 37%. More on that in a moment. Arbitrage on capital income between a company and a pension fund is now 32%. Massive difference. And arbitrage between tax on a trust and tax in an individual on capital account is 13.3%. That's huge. When JZ came into power, we were looking at the JSE being around 20,000 points. It's recovered up to about 35,000 thereabouts today. What the investors are not doing is a little computation. We say if you had 100 Rand on the day that JZ took over, what we get is that by today, CPI has taken that to not even 120. But importantly, after-tax interest in the lower interest rate environment that we're working on today, that is now sitting at below the consumer price index. Your money is rotting if you are receiving taxable interest. Whereas equities, even if subject to CGT, would be nearly at 160. You've got to take the point of view that you are dying slowly if you are leaving your investments in interest-bearing accounts.